Hello, everybody. My name is Sahar Mohammadzadeh. On behalf of students, mobilizers, and activists across the globe, allow me to express my deepest gratitude for the opportunity to share the power of young people to enact change. Now, 3 years ago, my presence on this stage would have been most unanticipated, and the same holds true for 3 decades ago. My parents both came here to the United States as foreign students, seeking opportunities here much larger than those promised to them back home. Now, they had the audacity to dream that through hard work and perseverance, the education provided to them here in the United States would overcome any obstacle and open any door. Education, their great equalizer, was the formidable force that drove their intergenerational hopes and dreams. They came home from their first parent-teacher conference, however, in a cold sweat. My preschool teacher had actually convinced them that I was mute. I was mumbling meaningless rhymes and severely lagging in my social development. And this observation lacked any correlation with the girl that my parents knew so well. By the age of 1, I was already talking their mother tongue of Farsi. By 2, I was speaking Spanish with my neighbors. By 3, I was starting to read the books my mother had grown up with during the Iranian Revolution. By 4, I was mute. This observation had to be seen in person. But the next day, my incoherent chatter was not dismissed. My parents recognized them as words, a mixture of Spanish and Farsi, but they were words nonetheless. My method of communication had been diagnosed as a disability. Now, this was the first time I began to realize the harsh disconnect between my real education and the education that others thought I was receiving. The first time I really registered what it meant to be young in America. I was curious, hopeful, but ultimately rather powerless. These initial years as a young Middle Eastern girl growing up in Kentucky, I had come to believe that these systematic issues were rather static, and I felt kind of hopeless to do anything about it. But it wasn't until I entered high school, nearly a decade later, that I started to have sort of like an awakening. I came to realize that just like me, many of my peers had this overwhelming sense of powerlessness, especially in the education system. For far too long, we were being dismissed by decision makers that cited our age and lack of experiences as hindrances to civic engagement. And for far too long, our real personal experiences were being cited as uncredible by policymakers simply because we were too young to vote. It was this sentiment that ultimately sparked 12 Kentucky students to meet at a coffee shop to discuss the role of education in our lives. Now, we had this radical idea that what we were experiencing wasn't just helplessness, but helplessness that was learned and could therefore be overcome. We didn't know this then, but this conversation marked the beginning of the Pritchard Committee Student Voice Team. And since then, our small band of teens has grown to hundreds, representing the geographic, socioeconomic, and ethnic diversity of the state, coming together in unity to solve the world's most pressing problems, especially when it comes to our public education. We discovered very quickly, however, that our conversations were not representative of Kentucky's entire student population. So we decided to hit the road, talking to as many students as we could, as often as we could, about their experiences in school and their plans after graduation. One of our very first conferences led us to Letcher County, one of the many rural areas in Kentucky where we met a student named Robbie, whose story we still can't shake. With little prompting, Robbie told us that he didn't know where his next meal was coming from. That his main reason for going to school was to find empty bottles, which he would later sell to the local recycling center to be able to feed his younger siblings back home. Now, although Robbie managed to graduate high school unlike most of his family members, and despite having a genuine passion for learning, he said he'd never go to college. He couldn't bear to leave his mother alone to take care of his family. Now, what does schooling mean to students like Robbie? To students like Charlotte, who recently lost her sister to the opioid crisis with no school counselors available for guidance. For students like Susie, whose low grades do not depict the fact that she works 2 part-time jobs only to come home to serve as the missing mother for her 11 younger siblings. To students like Brian, who when he applied for college was told by his family members to not go past his raising and now feels trapped in a college culture of stagnation. To students like Brianna, whose grit to pay the bills that her family have ignored for years manifests in her daily attendance at her night shift, but not in her low standardized test scores. It's important to note how open these students were to share their stories with us. Just minutes after a peer-facilitated conversation, they were letting open their heaviest of burdens and lifetime struggles. And it's important to note that student after student emphasized to us that this was the first time they thought their perspectives even mattered. Now, since then, and since Abby's original conversations, we've gone into every conversation with no preset agenda. We came ready to have the students tell us what the problems were, and we were truly building the plane as we were flying it. And we were building fast. With just in a couple of years, we were grappling at every single resource that we could muster to take the dehumanized education system and connect the voices of students to policymakers. We published national and statewide reports that brought together business leaders, students, educators, and policymakers. We were able to create PSAs that were able to highlight the difficulties of paying for post-secondary institutions. These PSAs were then broadcasted on every single local public television and radio outlet in the state. We hosted rallies and wrote and lobbied and testified for our own bill to add a student to the superintendent's screening committee when our bylaws previously prohibited to do so. And we even hosted statewide rallies in order to come together to write our book, Ready or Not. Now, this is our attempt to shine a light on stories that hide behind the statistics, much like you do as National Geographic Explorers. Within its pages, we truly wish to marry the head with the heart when it comes to policymaking. But in the end, all of this work was our way of conveying to adults that we are more than capable of igniting our own movements. That students are not just the future, but we are very much part of the present, and we are sick and tired of waiting for permission to change our world for the better. Now, this understanding is one I've kept close to my heart as I've made my own transition from high school to college this past year. Now, I know that college is supposed to be a time for self-exploration, but I keep coming back to education, whether that be through taking my courses and classes, traveling around the world with Harvard Model Congress to increase civic engagement among middle and high school students across the globe, studying international women's issues and lack of education with UN ambassadors, or even serving on the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Post-Secondary Value Commission. But throughout all of these platforms, the one thing that I have learned is that your truth is the most valuable tool that any of us have. And it should be celebrated, because our truths have the power to transcend any academic field, any geography, race, religion, or socioeconomic background. Our truths have the power to transcend any individual that stands in our way and tells us to wait our turn before we start solving the problems that are plaguing our daily lives, communities, and planet. Standing here before you today, I'm reminded of a student named Emma that I met in Fletcher Accounting. We're seeing that through all of these movements, especially those here held in DC, that so many students are being denied their truths. After our candid conversation, Emma asked me, "Are you actually going to do anything about this? Or are you just like everyone else that walks in, asks a couple of questions, pretends they care, and forgets about us the next day?" For far too long, students like Emma have been denied their truths. successfully blocked by policy and jargon and systematic barriers that disenfranchise those on the forefront of the world's most epic issues. But that time for silence and complacency, it's up. And we're seeing it through movements led nationally by our youth. And it's quite fitting that I'm speaking to you in DC, our nation's capital, as it's a reminder for all of you to capitalize on the youth when solving the world's most wicked challenges. Young people are the Earth's most untapped resource for hope. Now, this fight does not stop at the conference's end or when we go back to our classrooms or offices or even the wildest corners that Earth has to offer. I stand here before you today, National Geographic explorers, researchers, scientists, educators, citizens, that there is so much more left to do. More left to do for Charlotte and Brianna and Brian and Susie. More to do for parents like mine that traveled unimaginable distances for opportunity. More to do for our oceans and waterways that we still continue to pollute with chemicals and plastics. More to do to ensure a bright, successful, and sustainable future for every single young and not so young person across the globe. Now, of course, in all this, there's a role for you. And I implore each and every one of you to go back to your communities and incorporate young people in all that you do. Reach out to those that are quietest. They usually have the most to say. Invest early and deeply in the underdogs, especially those whose chances of success seem most bleak. And above all, just listen. By listening to the stories of those that have come before us, I hope that you come to understand, as I have, the profound and undeniable power that young people can bring to the table to make our world permanently better. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Felix. I'm one of about 75,000 children, youth planting trees all around the world to tackle the climate crisis. When I was 9 years old in 4th grade, my teacher asked me to give a little presentation in my class about the climate crisis. And when I prepared that presentation, I heard about Wangari Maathai, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate who had started a movement to plant 30 million trees with lots of other women across Kenya and East Africa. So we thought we should plant some trees as well, and we set ourselves a target, 1 million trees in each country of the world. But I don't think any of us knew what a million was or even how many countries existed. But a few weeks later, we planted our first tree, and we were incredibly lucky because 2 local journalists showed up and reported about that tree. And that's why some other local schools planted some trees as well. And we found a slightly older student who created a very simple website for us. And that website was essentially just a ranking among local schools of who had planted the most trees. So lots of schools wanted to outcompete their neighboring schools, wanted to be at the top of our leaderboard, and this is how Plant for the Planet spread. After 1 year, we had planted about 50,000 trees. After 3 years, 1 million, and children and youth all across the world started joining us and started planting trees with us. And all these children and youth started to do a lot more than just plant trees. They started giving presentations in their classes, but then also in front of Rotary clubs. They started talking to their mayors and other government officials. Many spoke in front of their national parliaments or had sit-downs with their presidents. And on 3 occasions, our members have even spoken in front of the UN General Assembly. And I want to just tell you one example. This is Jana. She's 12 years old. And a few months ago, she gave a talk at a conference just after the CEO of Deutsche Bank and her governor. And people were so impressed that journalists only reported about her. And a few weeks later, she got an invitation from her governor for a sit-down meeting. So she went there and explained to him for half an hour that he needs to make his state the first carbon neutral state. And actually, I just heard a few days ago, she got an invitation to meet him again. So I'm very excited about how that will turn out. And none of this is an accident, because we organize Plant for the Planet academies all around the world to empower our young members to do exactly that. So at these academies, we bring together lots of kids, and they learn about climate change, why it's so important to plant trees, and most importantly, they make plans of what they want to do next. And so far, we've organized about 1,200 such academies in 71 countries. And maybe this is why, after Wangari Maathai passed away in 2011, the UN Environment Program asked us to lead the Billion Tree campaign, the campaign she had initially started. That campaign had the incredible goal of planting 1 billion trees, but became so successful that by now 13.6 billion trees have been planted globally, thanks to governments, organizations, and companies all across the world contributing. And this is why, a few years ago, we started asking ourselves, where do we go from here? What's the next step? And because of that, we had two big questions. I think very obvious questions. The first one was, how many trees even exist globally? And the second question was, how many additional trees could we plant? And we obviously thought that those were very simple questions, so we asked a couple of ecologists and a couple of climate scientists, but soon noticed that nobody had any real answers for us. Until we found 3 phenomenal scientists at Yale University who did a 3-year research project for us and came back to us with 2 important answers. The first one is that about 3 trillion trees exist globally. And to give you a bit of context, we used to have about double as many trees, but in human history, we reduced them to 3 trillion. And the second, more important answer was they did a study to figure out how many additional trees we could plant without competing with agriculture and other land uses. And they concluded that we could increase our global forest cover by up to 30%. To 4 trillion trees. And if we managed to plant these trees, they would capture about 1/3 of all human-made carbon emissions. So obviously, they wouldn't solve the climate crisis, but they would be a sort of time joker, allowing us to actually keep our Paris commitments and ensure that climate change, temperature rise, does not rise beyond 2 degrees. And what I think is most amazing, most fabulous about all of this is that by far the most potential for new forests exists in Africa and Latin America. So by planting trees there, we can also tackle global inequality by creating hundreds of millions of jobs and an incredible amount of wealth through these wonderful resources. And through those years in our work, we also noticed that it's not just about the number of trees we plant, but also about how we plant them. And that became incredibly clear to me when we had a little project with a local government in southern Mexico. And during that project, we found out that the average survival rate of local tree planting projects was just 22%. So they planted lots and lots of trees, but if you came back to a year later, only 22% survived. So we wanted to show that it's possible to restore forests more efficiently and more effectively. And this is why we took over the responsibility of 22,000 hectares of degraded rainforest. And we started restoring that area. Today, we have over 100 employees there and plant on average 1 tree every 15 seconds. And we've now achieved a survival rate of not 22, but 94%. And it only costs us an average €1 per planted tree. So how do we fund all of this? Obviously, we've got private donors, we've got some companies helping us, but the main way we fund our trees is actually chocolate. And this started about 8 years ago when we wanted to do a project with the German chocolate industry. But not a single company wanted to support us. And this is when one of our members, Max, I think he was like 11 at the time, said, let's make our own chocolate. And of course, we all laughed at first, but this turned into the Change chocolate, which is, of course, fair trade and carbon neutral. And with every 5 bars of the chocolate, we can plant a tree, because the entire profit from the chocolate goes directly into tree planting. And it has now actually become the most sold fair trade chocolate in Germany. And currently, we're also working on an app for the chocolate. So if you're out in the city, near a store that sells the chocolate, you'll hear a beep in your pocket and know where to go shopping. And a few years ago, we asked the astronauts on the International Space Station if they wanted to try as well. And a few months later, 12 bars of the chocolate were on board the Albert Einstein. So 2 bars of chocolate for every astronaut. And since then, we call our chocolate astronaut food. And in all of these years, we keep trying to figure out new ways to communicate our message. And one of the most effective ways we've discovered so far was our campaign, Stop Talking, Start Planting, where we cover the mouths of famous people to show that something has to happen. For instance, we took one such picture with the King of Spain, and the day after we took the picture, it was in all newspapers. And not just in the newspapers, but on the cover pages. Here it's on the side, but we count that as well. And over those years, many of our members of Plan for the Planet have been protesting around the world. And in 2015, I remember a couple of our members said that we should do a climate strike. We should not go to school and strike instead to show how serious we are about this. And so we tried it, and we got like a couple of hundred kids in like 5 countries to participate. And we tried it again the next year, but it just didn't really work, so we kind of gave up on it. And then a few years later, this girl, Greta Thunberg, comes and has a similar idea, but does it much, much better. And obviously, lots of our members have been joining her since then, and what she has achieved is absolutely phenomenal. And I mention this because she has become my second big hero next to Wangari Maathai. And I think actually, her work hasn't made as big of a splash here in the US because your news cycle is a bit more distracted than in some other countries. But it's made a huge difference in Germany. Her work has been dominating our headlines since the beginning of this year. And polls have shown that at the beginning of this year, 9% of Germans believed that climate change was our biggest issue. And just a month ago, 24% of Germans said climate change was our biggest issue. And that was all thanks to her and all her supporters. So one last thing I want to tell you. We noticed, right, we're planting a lot of trees, but even if we continue scaling up, we might be able to plant 100 million by 2030, but nowhere close to the 1 trillion we need to get planted. So we want to make it as easy as possible for anyone around the world to join in and help us. And because of that, for the last 2 years, we've been building an app that we're going to launch officially this September. And the app is very simple. You sign up, and you have your own personal tree counter. And if you then go outside and plant a tree, you can register that tree and say what kind of tree you planted, when you planted it, where exactly you planted it, and so on. And if you're very enthusiastic, you can also add measurements of the trees as it grows. But there's obviously a lot of people that might be too lazy to plant trees themselves or just can't plant trees themselves. So what these people can do is they can go in this app and discover tree planting projects all around the world. And for every tree planting project, you discover what the average price per tree is, what the survival rate is, what kinds of trees they plant, and you can see satellite images of these projects and also how these projects have been developing over time. And then you can select your favorite project and donate directly through the app. And what's also really important is that we won't take any of the money, but 100% of the money goes directly to the tree planting project. And there's obviously a few other tools to make sure that this is fun to use, like competitions and a new type of Forbes list that ranks people not by how much money they have, but by how many trees they've planted. So if you want to try and see what this app looks like, the beta version is already available in the App Store and the Android Play Store. Trees are very simply the only machines we have that can capture CO2. And this is why our message is stop talking, start planting. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Melati, and I'm an 18-year-old full-time change maker. I'm very honored to stand here today and have gone after two incredible people that I really look up to and be a part of the event today. I can't wait to share my story with you, but in order to do that, I'm going to bring up a picture of a boat where my parents met and that I was lucky enough to call my second home. I grew up in Indonesia, and this is actually where my sister and I had our childhood games. We played all the time on this boat, and we would grow up sailing across the 17,000 islands of Indonesia. And you can imagine what this does to for a childhood. You know, we would wake up and look out the window and see a completely different scenario. That we'd wake up in a completely different area. I remember we'd go to sometimes so remote places that, you know, when we would flush the toilet on the boat, the phosphorus would glow, and my sister and I would just keep flushing and just see all of these, like it was a glowing toilet. Or, you know, we would wash up and there was a pink sand beach, or we would go to the most local tribes that we would see, and we would sit and listen to their cultures, sit and listen to languages we did not understand, but managed to connect with these people all across our beautiful country. And so, you know, we would go to the most wildest places where we would see a lot of different funky, cool animals that, you know, we would sometimes like to play with. And my sister, that's Isabel, she has a very, very different personality than me. She's usually next to me on stage, but she's currently finishing her 11th grade. So she says hi from the classroom all the way in Bali. But, you know, we started to recognize a problem when we grew up, where we're now in Bali in Indonesia. And no matter how far we would go, no matter to all the wild places we would discover and explore, the further away we got from civilization, it didn't matter. There was always plastic. It was everywhere. Whether we would go swimming in the ocean, we'd find plastic. Whether we'd go into the rice fields, there was plastic. In the mountains, there was plastics on the streets and the roads and the gutters. There was plastic everywhere. All right, so there was this awakening of plastic pollution that we just couldn't shake off. But at the same time, it was time to go to school. This is actually a photo. It's not the best resolution. I apologize. But it was also taken on an iPhone 4, so we got to appreciate that. But this is way back, and that blue little dot right there is actually my hair tie, back in 3rd grade. And we were learning, and take a minute to just remember the time that you first heard the names and the stories of people like Nelson Mandela, Lady Diana, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King. I remember the very day my sister and I learned about these real world leaders, these change makers that made a difference in their communities throughout history. And we went home that day and we looked at each other and said, well, what can we do as kids living on the island of Bali? What can we do right now? You see, we didn't want to wait until we were older to start making a difference. We didn't want to get our high school diploma, go to college, and then start making a difference. We looked at ourselves and said, we want to do something right now. So, next thing you know, here we are, ready to take action. Next to this inspiration of this class, right, connecting it back to the awakening of plastic pollution, we went home and we put papers out on the floor and we started brainstorming. What were some of the problems our island home Bali was facing? And again, that connection we felt to the environment, having grown up on that boat, going through Indonesia, connecting with nature at such an intense level, we thought we had to do something about the plastic pollution. And at the time, we learned that 40 countries around the whole world had already said no to plastic bags. So you can imagine, at 10 and 12, we thought, 40 other countries? Whoa. Come on, Bali, come on, Indonesia, we can also do it. And so without a business plan, a strategy, a timeline, or a budget, we created Bye Bye Plastic Bags. And the rest is history. We started 6 years ago now, campaigning. At the age of 10 and 12, we started Bioplastic Bags. I'm 18 years old now. And Bioplastic Bags has become one of the largest NGOs driven by young people in Indonesia. We've accomplished and created lesson plans that we go into schools, host workshops, spoken to over 50,000 people. And one of the most proudest achievements is, as of this year, Bali is implementing a ban on single-use plastic bags. Thank you. But there are many lessons that we've learned over the course of these 6 years, and some that I think cross over a lot of the work that you do as well. Lesson number 1, team. We learned this very early on. You cannot do anything by yourself. You always need to pull that team together. And for us, it was at first our closest friends, and we would host team meetings at snack time, lunchtime, at any chance we got after school. But lesson 2 came quickly after. Think outside the box. And I think this is something that comes naturally, actually, to our generation. If you didn't realize from the 2 previous speakers before me, we're constantly put in a position where we have to think how we can creatively overcome obstacles. And the story that I attached to this lesson is actually Bali's biggest cleanup. So when building a movement, right, we depend on the hope of people, their engagement, how we can get them to feel personally involved in the movement. So we're 5 years running, 4 years running, when we thought, okay, we're starting to lose people. They don't believe in it anymore. They're thinking, really? Is Bali really going to ban plastic bags? And they stopped showing up. So we were having a team dinner one night, and this question came up of how can we keep people involved? And one team member actually raised his hand very quietly and said, hey, why don't we do Bali's biggest cleanup? The entire coastline in one day. And slowly, we started nodding our heads. And we said, yeah, that makes sense, why not? And so in a very short time frame, together with a collaboration across many different sectors on the island, we were able to pull off the first Bali's biggest cleanup. And over the course of 3 days and 3 years, 1 day each year, we managed to mobilize 45,000 people in 350 locations, not just the coastline, but the rivers, the schools, the streets, the rice fields, mountains. And we prevented 130 tons of plastic from entering the oceans. Now, lesson number 3. Those of you that are parents, I know my parents will definitely tell you that this is probably the hardest lesson to learn. Persistence and commitment is key. Walking your talk, not giving up when it gets difficult. And sometimes that means doing things that you don't always want to do. Instead of going to the movies, you're out there on the beach cleaning up, getting signatures at a petition instead of going to the mall or whatever teenagers do. But, this was, I think, one of the lessons that I'm still learning to this day, how to really embody this and stick to it. But I've learned over the course of these years is that this lesson actually brings the most incredible achievements. My personal favorite is actually seeing bioplastic bags spread across the world, where young people, when they're watching our TED Talk in the classroom or seeing our viral videos on social media, they are the ones that are reaching out, sending emails, sliding into those DMs, and saying, hey, I want to do the same back where I come from. And so that's where you can see bioplastic bags now implemented in over 40 countries around the world, where we have kick-ass young leaders who are in middle school, high school, and university that are now standing up in their communities saying that they want to ban plastic bags. But it's not just plastic bags, and it's not just the environment. There are so many issues that we're facing in our time, in our childhood. Whether it being the injustices happening to our education system, the broken education system, or the social injustices, gender equality, climate change. There are so many interconnected, urgent, and relevant issues that we're facing in the world today. But the good news is that young people are rising all around the world in every single corner. And this is where the momentum is building. This is where we're seeing a trend, but also a lifestyle where we're recognizing that the time we're living in, we have the technology, we have the innovation, we have the young, bright people that want to get up. I've spoken to many young people around the world. That's my main audience. And it's brought me to many different classrooms around the world. One thing that I really feel that we're missing is that we're seeing that young people are hungry for the knowledge, for the right skills, for the right tools, for the experience to get connected, right? And we heard that earlier at the introduction of this session. Connection is what we're losing. We don't have. Classrooms are currently not teaching. How are we supposed to get kids who never see or engage with the environment to care about the environment? How do we get kids to feel motivated and a part of this global situation that we're a part of? And that's one of the unique parts of when our team goes on, or when Felix steps on, or when Sahar steps into a classroom. We're bringing this relatable factor where kids are seeing something that is possible. They are able to relate, and something inside them clicks. And I see them sit a little straighter, take a deep breath, and say, wait, how old are you? Wait, I'm 18 too. Wait, do you still go to school? Yeah, I graduated, but I went to school, and I had homework, and I had to study, but it's possible. So naturally, and here's our next project, we decided that we had to create a youth-topia, right? Where we provide those real-world examples of young people who are on the front lines, getting all of those world-class people like Felix, like Sahar, like Greta Thunberg, like Shitezkat, like AOC. All of the young people who are on the front lines, breaking boundaries, challenging the status quo, and getting these real-life people to teach other young people around the world. We need to be able to scale up that attitude and teach the how so that everyone can be a change maker. I really, really believe that us kids may only be 25% of the world's population, but we are 100% of the future. Thank you.